Want to elevate your travel experience? Here's how. With a Delta SkyMiles Reserve American Express card, you can relax before your flight in the Delta Sky Club with up to 15 visits per medallion year. And now through July 15th, 2026, you can earn up to 125,000 bonus miles, so you're closer to your next adventure. The Delta SkyMiles Reserve card. Check out the new design at www.delta.com/Spotify. Minimum spending requirements and terms apply.
This is True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time. Week by week, you'll hear the true stories behind the operations that have shaped the world we live in. You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position? I'm Rhiannon Needs, and this is True Spies from SPYSCAPE Studios. Bitter Fruit and Black Ops. May the 1st, 1952. Castoria, northern Greece. Under the cover of darkness, 6 men make their way toward the Albanian border. Dressed in three-quarter-length coats and caps, the men are carrying $260 in single bills and 225 gold pounds. A small fortune in that part of the world at the time. With Albania celebrating the May Day holiday, the men slip over the border undetected, which is just as well, because they're also carrying SPYSCAPE submachine gun, Walther P38 pistols, a clutch of hand grenades, knives, and, perhaps most importantly, a radio transmitter.
This team go overland, make their way to central Albania. The operation looks like it's going well.
After crossing the border, the team bid farewell to the scouts that have escorted them thus far. This is no place for unarmed bodies, because these men have entered one of the most oppressive, closed-off communist regimes in the world.
You've got Enver Hoxha, who's the communist ruler of Albania, the long-term, dictator. He has this very ruthless streak to him. And the Albanian security services, they're increasingly effective.
The team we're following are anything but communist. In fact, they're Albanian dissidents, loyal to an exiled king, which makes this operation risky at best. At worst, suicidal.
The kind of individual infiltration mission to former loyalist heartland and hopefully make contact with people who still want to see the king return to Albania.
Over the next few days, the team rendezvous with local contacts across the country, building a picture of resistance cells throughout the Albanian state.
And for several weeks, they're pretty successful.
On May 27th, the men turn on their radio for the first time since insertion. It's time to update their sponsors. At a safe house in Athens, a rapt audience tune in. Some of those receiving are also Albanian exiles and resistance fighters, but they're joined by several CIA officers, the ultimate backers of this mission.
CIA field officers are hoping it will prove that there is a basis for a resistance movement to be established.
Delighted at what he's hearing, the operations station chief cables back to Washington. The message he sends is optimistic. There is basis for hope that this will bear a rich harvest of bitter fruit for Albanian communist palates. Words that will echo quietly through the decades.
It's so significant because the CIA cuts its teeth in Albania. This was completely unprecedented for the United States. The kind of institutionalization of covert action is taking place in this period.
The CIA's Albanian operation remains one of the least well-known of the Cold War, despite being one of the largest ever conducted.
The capacity that they developed to undertake the operation, the propaganda and the infiltration operation is extraordinary. And it dwarfs, I think, a lot of those other operations that are better known in places like Iran and Guatemala, Indonesia, Cuba later, of course.
This is Stephen Long, Assistant Professor in International Relations at Xi'an Jiaotong Liverpool University in Xi'an. He's the author of a new book on post-war espionage in Albania, A Rich Harvest of Bitter Fruit. And in this episode of True Spies, he's taking us behind enemy lines with Operation BGFiend, also known as Operation Valuable.
This is how we can understand today's world, and you've got to go back to the roots of it, and Albania is where this all begins. It's remarkable.
As World War II neared its climax, the situation in Albania was complicated. From 1939 to 1943, it had been occupied by Mussolini's Italian fascists. Then, when the Italians signed an armistice with the Allies, Nazi Germany had swept in, which would have been bad enough on its own, but that was far from the end of it.
There were three factions that were fighting to liberate the country from, German rule, German occupation, but they were also fighting amongst each other. So there's a civil war going on at the same time as this resistance to the occupation.
On one side of that civil war was the former king of Albania,
King Zog.
Then there was the fledgling Communist Party, and a third group that stood in opposition to both, the anti-monarchist, anti-communist BK Party. In fighting both each other and the Nazis, Albania became a powder keg of political resentment and military viciousness. For his part, King Zog was desperately trying to reclaim the throne that the Italians had kicked him off of at the beginning of World War II.
He's in exile in London during the war. He's a very colourful character, highly intelligent.
Fun fact, Zog is a contender for the most prolific smoker in history. Some 225 cigarettes a day by some counts.
He's a secular ruler, a moderniser, but he is quite authoritarian. He's not sort of democratic by any means. Survives a whole number of assassination attempts and countless blood feuds against him and this kind of thing.
Zog also holds the distinction of being one of very few heads of state who shot back during an assassination attempt. While he was certainly a fighter, Zog's absence during the war gave Albania's communist upstarts a clear advantage.
The communist partisans who end up being triumphant, they end up liberating the country, and they're the kind of most effective resistance force. These other groups basically either go into exile or they're cracked down upon, and so that's the kind of story as Albania emerges from the war.
But Albania was different to most of the other communist states that sprang up after 1945.
Stalin is the key patron of those, other Soviet bloc states. Albania doesn't really have much Soviet influence at that time. It's dominated by Yugoslavia, ruled by Tito.
As supreme commander of the Yugoslav partisans during World War II, Josip Broz Tito led Europe's most effective anti-Axis resistance movement during the conflict. He became Prime Minister of Communist Yugoslavia in 1943.
And so it's really, even though this guy Enver Hoxha takes power in November of 1944, really it's Tito who's kind of pulling the strings inside Albania.
Putting it mildly, Tito was a strong personality. And eventually, that put him at odds with his fellow communist strongman in the Kremlin.
Tito and Stalin fall out in mid-1948. Their differences had been bubbling under the surface for months, but it all comes to a head in June 1948 when there's a very public spat and Yugoslavia is expelled from the Cominform, this collection of communist states, by the Soviet bloc, and Stalin basically makes every other communist ruler sort of step into line and excommunicate Tito.
Albania's ruler, Enver Hoxha, chose to throw his lot in with Stalin, showing two fingers to Tito. And this rather piqued the interest of a newly formed intelligence agency, thousands of miles away.
The Americans in 48, 49, they're starting to conceptualize a strategy to try to roll back communism in Eastern Europe. So 48, 49, just as the CIA is founded and setting up a paramilitary branch, CIA officers and State Department officials, looking on the map, and Albania looks to be the most vulnerable and the kind of supposedly the weakest communist state. Once Yugoslavia has fallen out with the Soviet Union, it's cut off as well from the rest of the Soviet bloc physically, geographically.
But the Americans aren't alone in this line of thinking.
The British and the Americans, independently, and at first without knowing that the other side is thinking about it, both governments start to contemplate an operation in Albania. And then when the British and the Americans get wind of each other's independent plans, they start discussing whether they can fuse them together rather than risking treading on each other's toes.
Eventually, the CIA and MI6 agree to cooperate on a joint operation. The Americans call it BGFiend, the British Operation Valuable. The idea was to spark an uprising against Hodges' communist government by providing weapons and operational support to anti-government factions inside Albania.
Need a laptop that's built to perform and designed to last all day? Select Windows 11 PCs starting at $499.99 are now at Best Buy. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
At ZocDoc, we know being a healthy adult is like living in a video game. Every day has side quests, taxes, laundry, birthdays, and just when you're leveling up, you have to book a doctor. The insurance portal crashes, they put you on hold, your doctor doesn't take your plan, game over. We see you, so we made booking a doctor easy. Download ZocDoc, search by specialty, insurance, and availability. Book instantly, no cheat codes required. Find a doctor you love with ZocDoc.
And so then you get this amalgamation of the two operations, which is kind of imperfect, but that then shapes the operation that gets launched.
But dealing with a country as complex as Albania required personnel with expert knowledge of the country. And there was one man who fitted the bill perfectly.
David Smiley, a very decorated, highly respected officer who served in Albania and other places, served for SOE during the war.
Smiley is put in charge of training recruits for insertion and operation within Albania, something he'd already done with distinction himself. He was joined in the operation by another former SOE man and MI6 spy.
Darrell Oakley Hill, who had had a career inside Albania during the Zog years, and then various American officers afterwards said, this guy was really smart and he absolutely knew his stuff about Albania. So you can see that both the CIA and MI6 were really trying to put in place the best people for the job, and they took the operation very seriously.
One of Smiley and Oakley Hill's American counterparts was a slightly different character.
This guy called Colonel Ed Hamilton, who stood out to me in particular that he had a false eye that he could pop out. And so he sort of, just to amuse the recruits, he would just take his eye out sometimes during training.
To recruit the best Albanian exiles for the operation, the CIA and MI6 set up a political organization.
The National Committee for a Free Albania.
The NCFA's stated aim was to organize Albania's émigrés and exiled dissidents against Enver Hoxha's communist leadership. But the Western intelligence agencies also used it as a front, a means to access the best, most willing operatives for missions inside the country. In fact, the NCFA's headquarters in Rome neighbored the CIA station that was tasked with running Operation BGFiend. But the man the agency put in charge of that station was not what you'd call a career spy. He'd spent most of his working life as a Madison Avenue advertising executive.
Joe Lee is definitely the most flamboyant character in the entire story, I think. This is a guy who hides in plain sight. His cover story is basically that he's fabulously wealthy, and so that justifies him kind of spending all the CIA's money to have this opulent lifestyle while he's in Rome.
Lieb's lifestyle and less than subtle style outraged many of his colleagues.
He's a very divisive figure. The CIA's kind of senior field officer in Athens, who's the exact opposite. He, from what I've read, couldn't stand him. Other CIA officers in interviews later said this guy, they just loathed him. They just thought he was appalling, about as subtle as the Vatican. One of the CIA's officers said.
Lieb was charged with keeping the different Albanian factions within the NCFA together. But he seemed more interested in driving around Rome in an Aston Martin, or spending time at the summer house he leased just outside the capital. all on the CIA's dime, of course. Indeed, one of his colleagues dubbed Operation BGFiend in Rome the Flying Circus for the sheer absurdity of it all. For the British, however, the mission was not an excuse for excess.
On the British side, you've got very highly respected people, very experienced.
And in late 1949, after extensive training at a fort in Malta, MI6 man David Smiley's first batch of recruits were ready for deployment. The plan was as follows. 6 teams would infiltrate into Albania on 3 separate missions, going 2 at a time. The first pair were codenamed Bail and Bribe, but the intel from inside Albania was in short supply. Both MI6 and CIA knew the mission's risks were very real.
MI6 goes first, so it launches 3 sea landings, 6 teams. So they sail a yacht basically from Malta to the Albanian coast and drop these recruits, these very courageous men, on the shore and then, sort of sail off into the distance.
Remarkably, the coast looks clear. The men make their way off the beach toward the interior. Taking shelter in a local's hut, they take stock. Calm descends. But by morning, the situation has changed dramatically.
And they encounter the Albanian security forces.
A gunfight breaks out. But the commandos are hopelessly outnumbered, a theme that recurs as the other teams land on the coast.
So it's quite tough going, Bale loses their team leader. Bribe is one of the 2 teams that are basically decimated, so 3 of the 4 agents that go in with that team are killed in action. Another team of the 6, codenamed Bogus, 1 of their agents is killed in action, 2 captured and later executed, 2 survivors.
Only 2 of the first 6 teams that enter Albania escape unscathed, managing to exfiltrate south back across the Greek border. Among their Western sponsors, the response is mixed.
The British look at it and say, well, we were expecting losses, so this isn't too bad, so let's continue with this.
But David Smiley, the former SOE man who had trained these recruits personally, takes the news hard.
Smiley himself is pretty distraught because he was hoping, obviously, all of his agents who he deeply cared about and, some of whom he'd known from the war and at least, that he'd bonded with during the training program, he was absolutely devastated to encounter any losses.
But the Americans back up their British counterparts, despite the setback.
The Americans as well, they basically decide, okay, this was anticipated, we should continue and see what happens in the next operational season in 1950.
As 1950 dawns, the CIA and MI6 are still training Albanian exiles and émigrés for Operation BGFiend. But this soon becomes just one part of the mission's broader tactics. For a start, the CIA starts printing propaganda leaflets to drop across the country from C-47 cargo planes.
The idea is that they basically kind of carpet bomb Albania with propaganda leaflets. They understand that 50% of the population is essentially illiterate, but they still do have textual content on some of the leaflets. But they also, in fairness, a lot of them are kind of satirical cartoons, mocking Stalin, mocking Hoxha and the Albanian Communist Party leadership, valorizing the peasantry, all of this kind of stuff.
One of the cartoons shows one man asking another what the Soviet hammer and sickle represents. He replies, "The sickle is to reap the crop. And the hammer? That's for your head afterwards."
Tapping into nationalistic tropes, whatever they can do to try to basically say, look, the National Committee for a Free Albania, the exiled anti-communist group, they're the true kind of supporters of Albanian nationalism, and with, some Western support as well behind them.
But while many of these leaflets were well made, they didn't always end up where Western intelligence had planned.
There are several occasions where they drop propaganda leaflets on the wrong side of the border, so they, a whole mass of leaflets end up in Yugoslavia, and the Yugoslav government representative goes to the British and American representatives in Belgrade and very politely says, we have a feeling these might belong to you because they're very good. They're very professionally produced. And, you know, those guys in Yugoslavia have an idea about the Albanian operation, but they're not intimately involved with it. So they're sort of scratching their heads thinking, those guys in Greece and Rome are at it again.
The propaganda effort didn't stop at leaflets. The CIA also set up a radio station.
Voice of Free Albania feigns to be an underground rebel radio station operating in Albania, but actually it's set up by the CIA as a covert facility just outside Athens with Greek intelligence and government approval.
At this point, though, there's tension between the American and British ends of the operation, all because of the radio station's first incarnation.
The Americans have this initial conception to run a yacht that will be beaming radio propaganda from the Adriatic, sailing up and down the Adriatic just off Albanian territorial waters so that they can't be, sort of impounded by the Albanian Coast Guard.
And blasting propaganda messages off the Albanian coast seemed a rather absurd use of time to the British.
It's meant to be a joint operation with the British, but the British pull out. The head of the CIA's paramilitary branch at the beginning, he's absolutely livid, feels like the British have betrayed him and everything.
But MI6 was the more experienced agency, and it showed.
The British, I think, recognise the technical challenges are insurmountable. The CIA pushes ahead because it's not really experienced. This is the first time it's done it.
Things do not go well for the Americans. The boat's engines prove so noisy that the radio can only broadcast when they're turned off, rendering the idea of transmitting up and down the Adriatic coast impossible. What's more, on the first sea trial, the boat catches fire, and some of the radio equipment ends up flooded with seawater.
Basically, when it goes to sea trials in the Adriatic, the poor CIA officers on board say, well, yeah, we were almost electrocuted to death, and like, this ain't gonna work.
Recognizing that a fixed radio station would be altogether easier to run, the CIA sets up the Voice of Free Albania in Athens, Greece.
The CIA doesn't let the British come on board with it because they're so angry about the radio yacht venture that fails.
The Voice of Free Albania becomes the only part of the operation where the British bow out entirely, leaving it to the CIA.
Obviously, you need Albanians to be actually making the broadcasts. It wouldn't work with a guy with a suspicious American accent, making the broadcasts. And you have the script writers, people who are kind of reviewing Radio Tirana scripts.
Radio Tirana was the communist regime's mouthpiece throughout Albania. If you know the enemy's message, you can turn it on its head.
Anything they can do to gather information that they can use as propaganda material, content for their broadcasts. They're also broadcasting propaganda into Bulgaria from the same radio station. So it is a kind of multi-functional facility.
Joe Lieb, the flamboyant former ad man, runs the propaganda campaign's leaflet drops from Rome, while his counterpart in Athens oversees the Voice of Free Albania. But while this aspect of the operation ticks along reasonably smoothly, the agent infiltrations prove no more effective as 1950 wears on.
Numerous agents are captured. British agents, British-trained agents, CIA-trained agents.
The communists' control of the country appears ironclad. Counterintuitively, the sheer amount of foreign spies working within Albania makes the CIA MI6 operation far harder to pull off.
Yugoslav agents, because of course now Yugoslavia is an enemy of Albania, they're running intelligence agents and a lot of them are captured. Greece and Italy are also running agents into Albania. It's a hotbed of intrigue at this time. And the Albanian security services, they're pretty overworked as a result of this, but they're increasingly effective at countering this very serious challenge to their regime's survival.
And as 1951 comes around, disaster strikes.
1951 is really where it comes to a head because the Hodges government takes a decision, right, we need a very public a very ostentatious show of how effective we've been at hoovering up some of these foreign-trained infiltrees. And so they very deliberately stage show trials in sequence. So, they run the British show trial, then the American one, then the Yugoslav one. And for the British and the Americans, but also, of course, for the Albanian anti-communist emigres working for Western intelligence, this is a huge blow to morale. It starts to sap the life from and energy and vitality from the operation.
Recognizing that serious changes are in order, the British and the Americans rethink their entire approach to agent infiltrations and tradecraft. Not least because the pool of potential recruits they're drawing from is starting to dry up.
You do have a case of some of the Albanian emigre leaders saying, okay, after this experience, we don't want you to work for the Western services anymore. This is just a suicide mission. So there is, you start to see the pushback from the emigres at this point as well.
Which sees the Americans in particular turn to an old acquaintance.
The Americans basically are much more keen to have a broader and a better quality pool of agents from which they can recruit. And so they turn to Zog really because they're running out of options at this point.
By 1951, Zog, the former king of Albania, is in Egypt, still exiled, still looking for a route back.
And so Zog, who is courting favour, he's courting the Americans as well. He's keen to be seen to be a player in Albania still. So he accepts that offer and allows some of his personal bodyguards and other people who are still kind of politically influential or formerly influential figures inside Albania to be recruited by the Americans.
These monarchist hardliners form a new unit within Operation BGFiend, Team Apple,
which was a kind of individual infiltration mission to tap into Zog's former loyalist heartland and hopefully make contact with people who still want to see the king return to Albania.
And at the head of Team Apple is a legendary figure in then recent Albanian history, Hamid Matiani.
Matiani is this legendary figure. He's like a celebrity amongst the anti-communist exile movement. He's run at least a dozen infiltration missions working for Greek, Italian, OSO and OPC, so sort of intelligence and paramilitary branches of the CIA. He's run operations for several years since the end of the war, working for all of these different intelligence services. He is the number one guy, both from the emigre community's perspective, but also from the communist government's perspective. That's the one guy they really want to get their hands on and capture and make an example of him. His success is down to the fact that he has a pretty big following of very loyal supporters, people, sort of brothers in arms who'll do anything for this guy, very trusted people that he works with, and, good kind of guerrilla fighters and that sort of thing. He's also very successful because he always conducts his missions on his own terms.
On May the 1st, 1952, Team Apple infiltrate Albanian territory from Greece. The mission you heard at the start of this episode.
This team go overland, make their way to central Albania, and for several weeks they're pretty successful, reaching out quietly to various Zogist supporters in the area in central Albania where Zog was from and still had some sympathisers.
The team are encouraged by what they find. Not only does the former king still have a strong following in the country, there is notable anti-communist sentiment too. Or, as one of the CIA officers overseeing the operation puts it, a rich harvest of bitter fruit for communist palates. Radioing back to Athens HQ, Team Apple sound upbeat. They believe something can still be done to overthrow communism in their beloved country. After a few weeks of network building, most of the team safely exfiltrate back to Greece for debriefing, leaving just the radio operator and one other fighter in place.
Hoping to then be supported by new agents in the future, in the coming months. The operation looks like it's going well.
But a few weeks later, Athens HQ notice a subtle change in the radio messages being relayed back to them.
When you're sending radio communications, the CIA radio officer in Athens can recognize, the hand, the signature of the agent radio operator.
That's the unique rhythm with which a radio operator taps out their code. A fingerprint, if you like. If that changes, something's up. So, due diligence. The CIA asked the operator to explain. A message soon comes back.
The radio operator, he's still completely independent, he's not captured, everything's fine, but unfortunately he's broken his arm, so he's now having to send radio communications back using his left hand.
Reassured, the CIA takes the operator at his word. The mission continues.
They send in more agents with new danger signals, control signals, and they believe that they won't betray those confidential control signals.
Maintaining radio contact with the team over 16 months, the CIA learned that Apple are building a serious resistance network throughout Albania. They've even made contact with dissidents within the regime itself. Eventually, the legendary Hamit Matiani brings together a crack squad of fighters to infiltrate again. To many of the exiles, this feels like the moment they'd all been waiting for. The counter-revolution has arrived.
Welcome to a new era of baseball's great spectacle. The T-Mobile Home Run Derby, live on Netflix. The biggest sluggers in baseball put their talents to the test on All-Star Weekend. Raw power meets star power. Big swagger meets bigger slams. And you don't swing to make contact. You swing to make history. Watch the T-Mobile Home Run Derby live on Netflix this Monday, July 13th at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific.
This episode is brought to you by Starbucks.
That is fire!
Whoa, that's good. This might be the drink of the summer.
Okay, I like this one too. I'm rocking with it, okay.
Try it for yourself. Starbucks Refreshers Concentrates are coming home. Find them in the coffee aisle and make it yours.
Parachuting into central Albania, Matiani and his men link up with the rest of Team Apple and build further momentum toward regime change among various local groups. But then, in the spring of 1954, the CIA hear catastrophic news. In a show trial in Tirana, numerous members of Team Apple are wheeled out for the press. Then, after a few more minutes, another figure is brought out. Mobbed by journalists, the man holds his head high for all to see. It's Hamit Matiani himself. But looking at the man in court, the Albania exiles and their Western sponsors are shocked by what they see. Here was a man who carried none of the presence of the great Matiani.
He's basically humiliated, and that just speaks to the terrible ordeal that he must have suffered under interrogation. He puts up no kind of resistance during the show trial. He's clearly a kind of broken figure. And it's just pretty grisly, it's pretty horrendous.
As the show trial goes on, the CIA are as confused as they are distraught. Things had, after all, been going so well, at least according to the reports they were receiving via radio. In reality, Matiani and all the other Team Apple fighters had been caught almost immediately after reinsertion. The agency asks itself, how could we get it so wrong? With the benefit of hindsight, it's clear that they'd ignored a gigantic red flag, or flags plural.
Tahir Prensi, he sends coded danger signals back to Athens to basically that should flash the alarm bell that I've been captured, you can no longer trust anything I'm saying to you. But the CIA just dismissed it because they didn't want to believe that their agent had come to harm. They just, that very human emotion, because they really cared about him and they cared about the operation, and perhaps in a more self-interested way, careers were also at stake.
As it turns out, the radio operator hadn't broken his arm. The reality was far, far worse.
Prensi, the radio operator, somehow, a few weeks later, a couple of months later, managed to persuade his prison guard to try to escape with him to Yugoslavia, and they managed to bust out of Tirana, but then they were apprehended, they were surrounded and were shot dead in a forest a few miles outside Tirana. So then the Sigurimi now, the Albanian security service, has a massive problem on its hands. How do we continue to dupe the CIA? So they concoct this story that Prensi has broken his arm in the field. It is extraordinary that the CIA fell for that. That was where they absolutely should have cut their losses and said, this team is lost now. But no, they ended up believing it.
You know what happened next. More agents, more bodies.
Those agents are, of course, captured. They send back negative control rather than positive control signals. So the CIA is then reassured, oh, everything's fine. This guy really has broken his arm. We can carry on. And in total, 9 agents go in and are hoovered up by the regime as a result of this over the next 16 months.
Before the CIA could properly take stock, the show trial was over.
They end up deciding that the other agents will be executed by shooting, by firing squad.
But not Hamid Matiani.
They make a special case for him and they give him a public hanging, which is basically what they do to ordinary criminals and the lowest criminals. So they really are just trying to absolutely humiliate him, even in the way they sort of deal with him in his death.
With Albania's great resistance figure now executed, having been effectively fed to the communists by the CIA's incompetence, Operation BGFiend Valuable was dead.
With the Apple double cross, that's it. There's no going back from this. It's a very sad ending then for the émigré community, which is devastated to lose their champion, their most celebrated resistance fighter. And it's a huge success for the communist government.
A communist government that remained in power in Albania for decades. But for Stephen Long, that doesn't mean Operation BGFiend has little tangible legacy. In fact, far, far from it.
This was completely unprecedented for the United States. The CIA gained its experience, very deliberately used Albania as its laboratory and tested out these new covert action capabilities. This is where they're really sort of building up not just the operational infrastructure, but they're also rationalizing it at the policy level.
And facing the disaster they themselves orchestrated, the agency quickly reorganizes, sharpening its skills for other regime change missions to come.
They use that capability, that tactical expertise, to then run these other operations elsewhere. So I think that's why it's so important.
For Stephen Long, the largely forgotten men of Operation BGFiend are trailblazers, true spies and resistance fighters whose plight was studied in minute detail, helping to craft the geopolitical story of much of the second half of the 20th century in the process.
We just almost take for granted now that this is how states behave. Covert action is just part of the foreign policy toolkit. But for the Americans, they hadn't done this stuff in peacetime in the past. I think the lawyers were busy in this period. This is where they're really sort of building up not just the operational infrastructure, but they're also rationalizing it at the policy level.
Guatemala, Iran, the failed Cuban coup at the Bay of Pigs. These covert actions and coups d'etats still reverberate today.
The Albania operation has been sort of incorrectly remembered as being this exemplary case of failed rollback. In the book, I'm keen to argue that that's a misreading of it. It's actually much more about the tactical side of the operation that is where the legacy lies.
But it's important to remember that legacy's human cost, too. In 1992, after the end of communist rule, the great resistance fighter Hamid Matiani was posthumously awarded the Order of the Martyr of Democracy, a recognition, however belated, of the men who gave everything for their beliefs. I'm Rhiannon Neves. If you'd like to read more about Operation BGFiend Valuable, pick up a copy of Stephen's book, A Rich Harvest of Bitter Fruit. And join us next time for another rendezvous with true spies. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?